My sister-in-law and her husband, the lazy one who plays video games all day, want my house. But things take a bad turn for them when they mess with my dog. My in-laws have a toxic relationship with my husband, and it's starting to affect my life. You see, growing up, my husband was the favorite, the golden child, and his mom was extremely close to him. Jacob has told me that since his dad was often busy with work, he and his mom spent a lot of time together. But I've noticed that his sister, Sarah, was not treated the same way by their mom. While I'm sure my mother-in-law loves both her children, it's clear she favors Jacob. I'm also sure Sarah must have felt this growing up, which is why Jacob has always tried to be a good big brother to her, always being there for her. But the truth is, both Sarah and my mother-in-law often behave so absurdly that they cross boundaries. For example, when Jacob and I started dating, he had just graduated from college and lived in the same house as his parents and Sarah. My in-laws had given Jacob an entire floor to himself so he could have privacy and invite friends over. Naturally, Jacob would sometimes invite me to stay the night. However, there were several mornings when Sarah would barge into our room while we were still sleeping, without knocking. As you can imagine, there were times we weren't dressed appropriately, yet she acted like it was completely normal and would start talking to Jacob about random things. This was extremely uncomfortable for me. I felt embarrassed that she'd see me in my underwear, but she didn't seem to care. I understand that Jacob was living with his family at the time, so things like this could happen, but is knocking before entering a room too much to ask? I spoke to Jacob about it and told him I wouldn't stay over unless he installed a lock on the door. He agreed, but the next morning, Sarah tried to barge in again. When she couldn't get in, she started banging on the door and yelling, demanding to know why it was locked. Eventually, Jacob opened the door, and Sarah stormed in, furious, questioning why he had installed the lock. When she noticed me, she pointed at me and screamed, "It's her fault!" I was shocked by how rude and disrespectful she sounded. Jacob told her that it was his idea to install the lock, but she wasn't convinced. She argued that as siblings, they shouldn't have any secrets between them. Jacob explained that he didn't have any secrets, but had locked the door to stop her from barging in while we were sleeping, as it was disturbing. Upon hearing this, Sarah turned to me and yelled that I was interfering in their sibling relationship. I was overwhelmed and excused myself to the bathroom. Even from there, I could hear her yelling and Jacob trying to calm her down. When she finally left, Jacob came to comfort me, apologized for her behavior, and assured me he'd talk to her again and have her apologize to me. The next weekend, Sarah apologized, but her excuse was pathetic. She said she urgently needed to talk to Jacob, so she thought it was okay to walk in. Jacob firmly told her not to bother us like that again, and she timidly agreed. Though this issue was resolved, it wasn't the only strange behavior Sarah displayed toward Jacob. If Jacob and I disagreed on something, even something as trivial as a movie, Sarah would jump in and suggest he should date someone with similar interests to his. She'd even say that we weren't right for each other. Jacob would glare at her, but she'd just smile. Another incident involved her probing into my past. She'd ask intrusive questions like, "Why did your ex break up with you? Were you not good enough for him?" Or make snide comments like, "Jacob's ex-girlfriend was prettier than you." These remarks always happened when we were alone. I started suspecting that she was trying to undermine me, but I stayed quiet at first. However, after several days of this, I'd had enough. One day, I snapped back, saying I preferred my ex's family because they weren't as nosy or controlling. Sarah seemed shocked by my reaction and stayed quiet for a while. What I said was true, though. Her strange behavior wasn't limited to me. My mother-in-law wasn't any better. When I first entered their lives, she ignored me. But once she realized Jacob and I were serious, she acted like I was intentionally stealing her son. She'd ignore me at dinners and family gatherings, behaving as though I didn't exist. Sometimes Jacob noticed and tried to address it, but she never changed. She even once called me spoiled, because my parents had sent me to private school while she was a public school teacher. I later found out that she had tried to convince Jacob not to marry me, suggesting he could find someone better. Fortunately, Jacob didn't care about her opinion and proposed to me anyway. When my mother-in-law and Sarah found out about the proposal, they went ballistic. Both called me to say it was a mistake and urged me to break off the engagement and return the ring. I thought they had crossed a line and refused. Realizing they couldn't convince me, my mother-in-law reluctantly told me to be the best wife and take care of Jacob like she had all these years. I was offended but chose to let it go. Sarah, on the other hand, accused me of being a gold digger, claiming Jacob deserved someone of higher status. It was ironic. First, private schools made me spoiled, and now I wasn't good enough. She even threatened to expose me before the wedding to prevent Jacob from marrying me. I told Jacob everything, and he was shocked at how rude they had been. He confronted them, but they didn't change their stance. Jacob reassured me that he loved me no matter what they thought, but it hurt that his own family wouldn't accept me. We had already decided to pay for our wedding ourselves. When my mother-in-law offered to cover half the expenses, we politely declined, explaining we had saved for it. Instead of being happy for us, this made her even more upset. She began telling Jacob how sad she was that he no longer needed her. In contrast, Jacob's father seemed proud of us. Unlike his sister and mother, his father was a calm man who never had any issues with our relationship. Since my mother-in-law kept complaining to Jacob, we reached a compromise and suggested that she could organize the rehearsal dinner for us. She agreed, and we hoped this would bring peace. However, as the wedding drew closer, things took an unexpected turn. The first incident occurred when my sister-in-law invited herself over for dinner, claiming she missed Jacob. At the time, Jacob and I were already living together after getting engaged, so we assumed she genuinely wanted to spend time with her brother. Jacob asked if I was okay with hosting her for dinner, and I reluctantly agreed, wanting to be polite. During what started as a pleasant dinner, my sister-in-law suddenly began talking about how much she despised unfaithful couples and how cheaters were worthless. We looked at her curiously, wondering where she was going with this. Then, she stared directly at me and asked, "How does it feel to be worthless?" I frowned in confusion. Out of nowhere, she began yelling, accusing me of having an affair with my coworker, Zach. Jacob asked her what she was talking about, and she triumphantly pulled out photos of me and Zach, waving them around as proof of my infidelity. I was stunned but not worried, because I knew I had never been unfaithful to Jacob. Zach and I were just close coworkers who started at the company at the same time. We often helped each other fix mistakes to avoid trouble with our boss. Zach even had a girlfriend, and Jacob knew about him. I had no secrets with Jacob. My phone wasn't locked, and I had always been open about my coworkers. When we looked at the photos, they were harmless. They were snapshots of casual moments that my sister-in-law had twisted into evidence of a made-up affair. Her baseless accusations felt like a deliberate attempt to tarnish my character and strain my relationship with Jacob. Before I could defend myself, Jacob, visibly upset, stepped in. He demanded to know why his sister had been following me and taking pictures of me with my coworkers in public places without anyone's consent. She tried to justify her actions, claiming she was investigating me because I wasn't of their social status and might be marrying him for his money. Jacob firmly told her that her claims were unfounded and that she was stirring up unnecessary drama. He tried reasoning with her, asking her to stop spreading lies and trying to damage our relationship. But she continued yelling at him, insisting he open his eyes to my so-called affair. I also tried explaining that Zach and I were just co-workers, but she stubbornly clung to her accusations. As the tension escalated, I had enough. I told her I would file a police report against her for taking my photos without consent and harassing me. Her face froze as she asked if I was serious. I told her I had all the evidence of her stalking me and using the photos to spread ridiculous lies about me. When she asked what I wanted, I told her I wouldn't press charges as long as she stayed out of my life. Realizing there was no way out, she reluctantly agreed. Jacob supported me and told her she should be grateful I was willing to let it go since her actions were clearly wrong. Since that day, she and I haven't spoken. Jacob still has a relationship with her, but she has never dared to speak to me again. The second incident before our wedding happened the night before, during the rehearsal dinner. My mother-in-law had insisted on taking responsibility for the event, declining any offer of help. She assured us she would handle everything. However, when we arrived, it was obvious that the preparations were far from what anyone expected. The dinner consisted of plastic tablecloths on picnic tables and cold Mexican food. Throughout the evening, she acted irritated, which made the atmosphere uncomfortable. Things got worse when she drank too much and began behaving inappropriately, complaining loudly about how stressful the wedding preparations had been, even though she hadn't contributed financially or helped with the planning. Eventually, my father-in-law became angry and escorted her out. My sister-in-law protested, trying to defend her mother's behavior, but my father-in-law wouldn't listen. The rehearsal dinner turned into a complete disaster. I started panicking, worried that these two women would ruin my wedding the next day. That night, Jacob and I had our first major argument. I told him firmly that both his mother and sister needed to be uninvited from the wedding. Given their behavior, I was sure they would do something to overshadow us during our big day. Jacob strongly disagreed and tried to reassure me, saying his father would be there to keep them in check. But I was overwhelmed and told him that if he didn't uninvite them, there would be no wedding the next day. Jacob was visibly shocked by my ultimatum. I knew how harsh it sounded, but I was anxious about what they might be planning and didn't want to be humiliated in front of my family and friends on my wedding day. Fortunately, Jacob understood my concerns and made the difficult decision. Early the next morning, he called his father to let him know his mother and sister were no longer invited to the wedding. To our surprise, his father wasn't even shocked and assured Jacob that he would make sure they didn't show up uninvited. Shortly after the conversation, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law began calling Jacob repeatedly, clearly trying to persuade him to let them attend. Jacob stood his ground, telling them that after how they had treated me, he didn't feel comfortable having them at the wedding. My mother-in-law accused me of driving a wedge between her and her son, while my sister-in-law also tried reasoning with him. However, Jacob remained firm in his decision. I felt bad that my father-in-law couldn't attend because of his wife and daughter, and I regretted giving Jacob an ultimatum. But all of my guilt disappeared when I learned from some of Jacob's cousins that my sister-in-law and mother-in-law had planned to wear white dresses to our wedding. They revealed there was a family WhatsApp group, exclusive to the women, where my sister-in-law had encouraged everyone to wear white, arguing that there was no reason the bride should be the only one in white. I was stunned by how far they were willing to go to hurt me. After learning about this, I was relieved they had been uninvited. While Jacob missed his family, he also understood my perspective. In the end, we had a wonderful wedding, and no one tried to steal the spotlight. Since that day, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law have completely stopped speaking to me, which I honestly appreciated. I was perfectly fine with them only inviting Jacob to family dinners or special occasions. My father-in-law, on the other hand, remained kind and supportive, and we kept in touch over the years. Recently, Jacob and I saved enough money to buy our first house. We were thrilled to become homeowners and hosted a small housewarming celebration. His parents and sister came to visit, but to avoid any drama, I went to my parents' house that day to spend time with my own family. Now, coming to the main issue, last month, out of nowhere, my mother-in-law called me. This was completely unexpected since she and I hadn't spoken since the day I married Jacob. Surprisingly, she casually asked how I had been and how life was going. Her sudden interest caught me off guard, but I answered her questions anyway. Then, she started asking how it felt living in such a big house with just Jacob and me. Her words stung because Jacob and I had been trying to conceive for a long time, but due to infertility issues, I couldn't get pregnant. Jacob knew about this, and although it was painful for both of us, we found comfort in each other. Of course, our families were aware of this too, so her subtle comments on the matter felt deliberate. She then went on to inform me that my sister-in-law was pregnant again. I was shocked to hear this because it would be her sixth child. Jacob had told me before that her husband didn't work and didn't believe in using condoms, which led to these accidental pregnancies. My sister-in-law's partner was the epitome of laziness, doing absolutely nothing to help her or the children. Jacob had mentioned how this man treated his wife like a personal servant, refusing to pay bills or contribute financially. Meanwhile, my sister-in-law juggled multiple part-time jobs just to make ends meet, while he spent his days playing games. Despite everyone advising her to leave him, she never did. Then, my mother-in-law dropped a bombshell. Since my sister-in-law could no longer afford to work during her pregnancy, she thought it would be a good idea for Jacob and me to give up our house. She argued that the house was too big for just the two of us, and suggested my sister-in-law and her family move in instead. I was stunned by this demand and struggled to find the right words. I asked her if she was joking, but my mother-in-law firmly stated that she was very serious. She explained that my sister-in-law and her husband deserved to live in a bigger house. Since she didn't have room for them at her own home, she expected them to move in with us. The weight of this announcement left me reeling as I tried to process the whirlwind of emotions. I explained to her that this was our home, one we were still paying for, and the idea of someone else moving in without our permission was absurd. However, my mother-in-law insisted that she and my sister-in-law had already spoken to Jacob, and he had agreed to it. This struck me as odd because Jacob and I share everything, and I was certain he would have told me if he'd made such a decision. I told my mother-in-law firmly that since the house belonged to both Jacob and me, he couldn't give permission without my consent. No one could live here without both of us agreeing. To compromise, I offered to let my sister-in-law and her husband stay for a few days if they needed temporary help, but I wouldn't allow them to move in permanently. My mother-in-law started yelling, saying it was expected of me, as a dutiful daughter-in-law, to make space for my sister-in-law's family. She added that if I accepted, all past issues between us would be forgiven. Angry, I responded sarcastically, "Sure, I'd be happy to let them live here. But since we're still paying the mortgage and I know they won't help with the bills, maybe you can take responsibility. How about paying the mortgage for us? We'll handle the utilities." I added, "And since your current job probably won't cover the mortgage, when are you planning to get a second one?" Hearing this, my mother-in-law erupted in anger, calling me ridiculous for suggesting she pay our mortgage. I shot back, saying it was equally ridiculous to expect us to support my sister-in-law's family and let them move in. This enraged her further, and she hung up when she realized I wasn't backing down. Shortly after, my sister-in-law called me, yelling about how I had the audacity to ask her mom to pay our mortgage. She went on to say she always knew I was a gold digger. I calmly replied that she was the gold digger, trying to live with us for free. I told her to look at her own husband if she wanted to see the real freeloader in the family. That shut her up. I made it clear that she could argue with me all she wanted, but under no circumstances would her family move into our house unless they contributed financially. She accused me of being heartless and prioritizing money over family. Update 1. Thanks to everyone for the support. Many of you have asked why my mother-in-law would make such a ridiculous demand. The answer is simple. She's always been this entitled. Clearly, Jacob has allowed her behavior to go unchecked for far too long, and he and I need to have a serious conversation about this. My sister-in-law is just a pawn in my mother-in-law's schemes, following orders in hopes of earning her favor. In this case, my sister-in-law stands to benefit since we'd be paying her bills and taking care of her kids while her husband continues to do nothing. I'm waiting for Jacob to return from his business trip so we can discuss this in person. Update 2. 3 days later, Jacob returned, and we finally talked. I told him everything about his mom's demands and her call. Jacob was visibly shocked and admitted he had no idea about any of this. The only thing his mom had told him before his trip was that his sister was pregnant. Nothing about moving in with us. He called my mother-in-law in front of me and confronted her. She tried backpedaling, saying she hadn't exactly lied but assumed Jacob wouldn't have a problem with it. He interrupted her, demanding to know why she thought it was okay to decide without consulting him. My mother-in-law argued that since Jacob and his sister were close, he'd naturally want to help her. Jacob firmly told her that under no circumstance would his sister, her husband, and their 6 kids move in with us. When my mother-in-law brought up how my sister-in-law needed someone right now, Jacob told her it wasn't our responsibility and suggested she take care of her daughter instead. Then she said something cruel. Since I was barren, helping my sister-in-law's kids would give me a sense of purpose. That comment made my blood run cold, but Jacob immediately lost his temper. He yelled at her, saying she had no right to use my infertility against me, and that anyone who disrespected me also disrespected him. With that, he cut the call. Since then, Jacob has had no contact with either his sister-in-law or his mother-in-law. His father called to speak with him, but after learning about the incident, fully understood why Jacob had made such a drastic decision. My father-in-law even apologized to me on behalf of his wife, but I reassured him that it wasn't his fault. On Update 3, the past couple of weeks have been eventful. Many people suggested I install cameras around the house in case my mother-in-law and sister-in-law decided to show up and cause trouble. So I did. I ordered cameras online and set them up around the house. Sure enough, they appeared last weekend banging on my door while I was home alone. I saw them on the cameras and immediately called Jacob, who said he was on his way. When I opened the door, there they were, my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, furious. They demanded to be let inside, but I refused and told them if they had anything to say, they could do it from outside. My mother-in-law started yelling, calling me heartless, greedy, and selfish. I calmly reminded her that this was our home, and they had no right to barge in uninvited. Unaware that everything was being recorded, my mother-in-law kept ranting. I reiterated our previous conversation and reminded her that I wasn't giving up my house for my sister-in-law and her husband. If she wanted to discuss anything further, she would have to wait for Jacob to come home. My sister-in-law accused me of breaking up the family and called me stubborn. She even went as far as calling me a gold digger and accusing me of trying to alienate Jacob from them. At that point, I told them everything was being recorded on the cameras and that I would use the footage to get a restraining order against them. If they ever came near our house again, they wouldn't be allowed within 100 meters. Their expressions turned to shock. My mother-in-law yelled that I wouldn't dare, but I smirked and warned her to leave immediately or face legal consequences. This frightened them. My sister-in-law tried to downplay the situation, saying I was overreacting. Just then, Jacob arrived. He calmly walked over and asked his mother what she was doing there. She tried to hug him, but he stepped back and firmly asked again why she and his sister were at our house. My sister-in-law accused me of controlling him and not letting him speak to them, claiming they had come to confront me. Jacob set the record straight. He told them it was his decision to cut contact and that he wanted nothing to do with either of them anymore. My mother-in-law began begging for forgiveness, but Jacob told them to leave our property immediately or he would call the police. They looked shocked, clearly not expecting him to take such a strong stance. Jacob added that if they ever showed up again, we wouldn't hesitate to involve the authorities. They left, visibly devastated, but Jacob didn't care anymore. I felt relieved and proud that he was finally standing up for us. Jacob later spoke to his father, who was as shocked as we were to hear that my mother-in-law and sister-in-law had shown up uninvited. He assured us that we did the right thing by not letting them in and expressed his growing frustration with their behavior. With Jacob's firm stance, I doubt they'll dare to return. But if they do, I'm ready to contact a lawyer and file restraining orders immediately. I'm glad Jacob finally realized how toxic his family is. I hope this will be the end of the drama, and we can move on with our lives in peace. Update 4. I had hoped my previous update would be the last, but unfortunately it wasn't. A few weeks ago, Jacob and I went on vacation. While we were away, my sister-in-law broke into our house. They smashed a window in the back, changed the locks, and moved in. We didn't have a full alarm system, but the cameras were still running. We had left our dog with an automatic feeder and a friend who came by every other day to check on him. Curious, I decided to check the camera feed on my phone, and what I saw made my heart race. There was my sister-in-law, her husband, and their kids lounging in my home. Her husband was sitting in his underwear, playing video games in our living room. Worst of all, my dog was nowhere to be seen. It turns out they had kicked him out, letting him out the front door and scaring him away. Jacob and I immediately ended our vacation and drove back. The trip was 5 hours, but we called the police an hour before we arrived. When we got home, there were police cars outside, and the officers were talking to my sister-in-law at the door. We explained that it was our house, and that they had no right to be there. Child Protective Services was called, and their kids were taken into custody. Meanwhile, my sister-in-law and her husband were arrested. As I reviewed the security footage, I saw that my mother-in-law had been there the day before, helping them move in. The police arrested her too for being an accomplice. They didn't spend much time in jail, but were pursuing legal action. We've filed restraining orders and are considering suing them for damages. They broke locks, damaged property, and cost us several days of our vacation. Thankfully, our dog was found by a kind neighbor who took care of him until we returned. He was shaken but unharmed and overjoyed to see us. As for my father-in-law, he's fed up with my mother-in-law's behavior and is considering divorce. Whether that happens or not is none of my business, and I don't plan to provide any further updates about it. For now, I'm relieved this nightmare is finally coming to an end.